Thank you, John Luke, and thank you, all of you. My name's Deborah KURATA, and we're going to talk about modules versus modules. So it was all just an illusion. Okay, so we're going to talk about ES 2015 modules versus Angular modules, and since John Papa told us to use lazy loading, we're going to try to use lazy loading and find that if you just try to do the little bit that John showed, it's not going to work, and why. All right. Sorry, John. All right. So, JavaScript has issues, right? Namespaces, code organization. Modules are supposed to be solving those issues. So Angular JS had modules, TypeScript has modules. ES 2015 standardized what a module should be. Angular uses ES 2015 modules, but it also has its own Angular modules. What's the difference? ES 2015 modules, when you think of those, you're thinking of code files. So an ES 2015 module is simply a code file. All we need to do is export something or import something, and our code file becomes a module. A module is a code file is a module as long as it exports or imports something. You can think of that as sort of being micro in nature. It's having to do with our code files, what our code files are exporting or making available to the universe, and what it's using from the universe by way of the imports. On the other hand, Angular modules you can think of more as being macro. They organize our application into cohesive blocks of functionality. We define a set of components, any of their related files, and any of their dependencies in a module. We add more features, we add more modules. What do those modules look like? They look like this. As with pretty much everything in Angular, an Angular module is simply a class with a specific decorator, our ng-module decorator. And we pass to that ng-module decorator a set of arrays. The hard part with Angular modules is figuring out what goes into what each of these arrays and what each one contains. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a little example and talk through how to set up all of these arrays. But first, you might notice here that we're exporting a class from this Angular module code file, and we're importing stuff into this Angular module code file. So our Angular modules are themselves actually ES 2015 modules. Okay, so here's our sample application. We've got a splash screen, we pick the product list menu option, and we get the product list page. The product list page uses a service to get its data that it's displaying here. It has a filter by box that's using two-way binding. When the user types something into that filter box, there's a custom pipe in the background that's going to filter our list. And then we have this nested component here that knows how to take a number and display it as stars. If you pick the product link there, you get to the product detail, which also is reusing that star component. So our architecture for that simple little application looks something like this, where we've got components for each of the main pages, for our star component, our product filter pipe, and our service. So how do we get all of these pieces? How do we put them all together with regard to an Angular module? Well, first of all, it's important to note that every Angular application that we build has to have at least one Angular module, by convention called app module. One of the first arrays that you need to think about is the declarations array. The declarations array contains components, custom directives, and custom pipes. So every component that we build has to belong to one and only one Angular module. In this example, we're going to start by putting it all into our root application module, our app module here. So you'll see on that list that every one of our components is there along with our pipes, and if we had custom directives, they would be there as well. The next array I want to talk about is the bootstrap array. That one's a little bit more straightforward. That simply contains our startup component. So whatever component has the selector that's inside our HTML page, our index.html, that's normally the one that we're going to put in our bootstrap array. Next is our providers array. Our providers array is for any of our custom services. If we use a service from somewhere else, we don't put it in our providers array. We're only putting in our providers array any services that we've created. The providers array has some special functionality associated with it, so we need to ensure that we only put services there, not other components or directives or anything else. Because when we put something into the providers array, at runtime, Angular will register that services provider with the application-wide injector. And that prepares those services then to be injected into any other code file or any other service that we have associated with our application. Next, we have the imports array. That one's sometimes a little bit more difficult to figure out what all goes in there. Basically, we want to pull in any Angular modules, so that's any Angular system pieces that we want to use. We also want to specify any third-party modules that we want to use, like Material Design or NGRX. And then also any of our modules, if we have other modules that we have functionality we want to use from them. We'll see an example of that in a few minutes. It's important to note, however, that there are two kinds of imports going on in Angular. That bottom one is what? It's our ES 2015 module syntax. So with that bottom one, we're pulling in something, this is a class, from a code file. The top one then is our imports for our modules. We're pulling in what our module needs. So it's much more at the macro level. The other thing that looks a little bit weird here is this last entry. When we are importing router module, we're actually calling a method called forRoot. And in that parentheses, that little dot, dot, dot there represents our routes. So we're putting our routes in there, and we're specifying then how our application routes look like. It is not always, though, forRoot that we're going to call. Let's talk about that for a moment. A simplified picture of the router module might look like this. It declares several router directives, like router outlet and router link. You can see by the gray line there that it also exports them. That's what makes those available to our other pieces in our Angular module. It also registers a service called the router service. Now, it's really important when we register services that we only register them one time. It's especially important with the router service because the router service works with our global location object from our browser. So we really want to ensure we only have one of those. So when we pull in router module, the very first time we pull it in, we use forRoot. And what that does is it configures all of the routes we pass to it. It provides us access to all of those router directives, and it registers the router service. If we need the router module in other Angular modules that we're going to write, we use forChild instead. And again, we pass it a set of routes. What the forChild does is it will configure any of those routes that we pass to it. It will give us access to those router directives, but it will not re-register that service. So that's why we use forRoot only one time, usually in our application module, our app module, and then we use forChild for every other module that we create. Okay, so going back to our picture, we've talked about all of our arrays except for exports. Notice that our app module doesn't normally export anything, but we can include in exports any modules, our components, our custom directives, our custom pipes, pretty much anything in our module we can export. By exporting it, then other modules can take advantage of using them. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. So, as we're working, we're building our application up, we're adding more and more functionality. At some point, our arrays are going to start to get really long. Now, when we're building a method and it starts getting really long, what do we do with it? Break it up. Thank you. We break it up. So the same thing happens here. We break up our Angular module into multiple Angular modules. So notice in this example, I've got all sorts of product stuff sort of intermingled with my application-wide stuff, like my page not found component. So I'm going to pull that all out so it's a separate module here. Those are frequently referred to as feature modules. You'll see them in the Angular documentation referred to as feature modules because we've pulled out all of the stuff for a particular feature area into its own feature module. Mine's called product module. Okay, there's a couple of things I want to talk about with this. First of all is the product data service. I pulled that into the product module because I like to keep all my product stuff together. However, since it is a service, even though it's registered in the in the product module rather, the feature module, it is still registered with the application-wide injector. Okay, because services are always registered application-wide. So that means if I did have one of my welcome components or whatever access that service, it will be allowed to do so. Okay, I probably shouldn't because it's the product data service, but it won't stop me from doing that. The other thing I wanted to mention is the new orange box up there at the top, common module. When I pulled in product module, or when I separated out product module, my product list and my product detail components still need some of the capabilities in common module. So what are some of those things? Product list has an ng-if and an ng-for. Product detail has an ng-if. Those are provided from common module. Now we also needed those in app module. Browser module not only makes it possible to do to make the application work in the browser, but it also exports common module. So since it exports common module, we also have access to all of the key directives like ng-if and ng-for in app module as well. But normally we only import browser module in our Angular app module, and we use common module for all of our feature modules. Okay? Then you will notice those. Here we're using router module for root and router module for child. Now, how do we know that we need forms module and HTTP module provided in these things? Well, what we do is we look at our components and we look at what they include, what their templates include. So since we knew that our product list template had an ng-if and an ng-for, we knew we needed common module. We know that it uses routing. We know that it navigates between the pieces with routing, so we know we need the router module. If you recall, our product list page had that filter with two-way binding, so that's how we know we need the forms module, because that's what's coming with binding, and so on. So you look at what's inside your components, what it is that they need, and that helps us determine what modules that we need to import into our imports array. Okay, so we're working along, we're adding our user features, and we add maybe a customer module, and we add an invoicing module, so we keep adding these modules. So here is our user module, for example. We're going to have a login component, and we're going to find as we add more and more modules that there are similar things that I start up here that we're importing into each one of them. Almost every feature module that we create needs common module because just about every template that we create uses ng-if or ng-for. We frequently need forms module if we're going to do any kind of two-way binding. And maybe for our particular application, we like for our users to be able to rate all sorts of stuff, so we want our star component showing the star ratings for those. So what we want to do is reuse all of those pieces. But it's kind of a pain to have to keep pulling them in every single time. What we can do instead is we can do a shared module. And what a shared module does is it allows us to combine what we want to share with the outside world. So here I've put common module, forms module, and star component. Now product module only needs to import shared module, and it gets everything that's in it. So it lets me kind of bundle up stuff and import it with one import instead of having to import multiple things and declare multiple things and so on. So it's sort of a shortcut. So here's what the code looks like. So here's our app module, and it pulls in all the things, including product module. And here's our feature module, and you can see how short that code is. Because we were able to import shared module, we did not have to separately import forms module or separately import common module or even declare our star component. They were all pulled in and are available to our templates because we imported shared module. And there's what our shared module looks like. So here's an example of where we're going to use the exports. We're exporting those pieces so that anything that imports the shared module can use them. Okay? So Angular modules organize the pieces of our application. They extend our application with capabilities from external libraries. That's what that imports array is doing. They provide a template resolution environment. Well, what does that mean? Well, our templates include things like directives, ng-for, ng-if. They include nested components and so on. So the template is being processed by Angular, and Angular finds a directive in there and goes, I don't know what this is. Module, do you know what this is? The module, sure, I know what that is, and it gives it to our template and it can continue on. If the module doesn't know what it is by way of an import or a declaration, then we get an error. Okay, so our module is what's defining what our template can access. We can also use modules to aggregate and re-export, like what we just saw with that shared module. We can also take that whole shared module concept a step further and provide configuration for the compiler that encapsulates functionality that can be consumed in any app. That's a lot of words, meaning that we can create libraries. So we can create libraries like material design that can be put up on NPM, and someone can just NPM down that one thing and get all of the access to all of its features without having to pull down its services and constants for its directives and all these different parts. We can, with modules, we can pull down one thing. Modules then can be loaded eagerly when the application is loaded or lazy loaded. Let's talk for a moment about lazy loading. Oh, I love that guy. Isn't he pretty? I wanted a picture that represents lazy but fast, right? Because isn't that whole idea of lazy loading is that it's improving the performance of our application, right? So we have our application sitting in one big bundle up there on the internet somewhere. The user types in the URL to your app. It has to bring that whole thing down off the wire and compile it, and finally brings up that first template. So there's quite a bit of time between the time that the user said, hey, I want your app, and that first template that displays. With lazy loading, we break out bundles, so that first little bundle that comes down is smaller, moves faster down that pipe, and then can display that first template so much more quickly. Okay, so the first time I used lazy loading, I followed the instructions of how to do lazy loading, and it just didn't work. And nicely, my friend Brandon helped me tremendously to actually make it work. And the problem was that I didn't know that there are 3 things that you have to do first before your lazy loading is ever going to work. First of all is you have to have feature modules, because if you don't have feature modules, there's nothing to lazy load. Lazy loading is based at the module level. You can't lazy load a service or a component. You have to lazy load an entire module. And you can't lazy load your app module because it has to be the thing that comes down. So you have to have some other modules. Second of all, you need to have your routes grouped under a single componentless parent route. So you notice that I have this main path for all my product routes called products. And it's the same name, the same base name for all of our paths there. And then every other route, so my product list component is an empty path, so it'll go with just /products. Then product detail is product/:ID. And then product edit, I added an edit feature on there to have one more here, and so on. So what we're going to do when we lazy load is we first need to set this up so that these are children of a single route. Then we're going to take those two statements, that path and that children property, out, and we're going to put them somewhere else. Those are considered a componentless parent route because it doesn't have a component associated with it. The component is always associated with the children instead. And lastly, we need to not import the module into any other module. So right now we're importing product module in. We need to remove that because otherwise when we bring down our app module, it's going to say, oh, I need product module, and pull it with it, which kind of defeats the entire point of lazy loading. So we need to make sure that before we do what John Papa said, that we do these three things first. Then we can do, and this is the same syntax that John showed, we specify our path. So this is that path that we had. We move it from our feature module and add it into a module that is already loaded. So here it would be our app module. And then we specify load children, giving it the full path to our module, a hash, and the name of the module class. So we exported class product module, so that's what we put there, a product module. Okay, with that, we talked about ES 2015 modules, Angular modules, and lazy loading. Thank you all so very much.